Hey, greetings everyone. Hope everyone's having a nice summer. This is the first video for the summer module for IB History HL2. This is a quick one. All we're going to do is establish kind of the introduction to war. A lot of this stuff we've actually already gone over before we did World War One and World War Two. However, since we're going to start this bigger unit and study four wars this summer, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to recap as well as use some of our now new knowledge on World War One and World War Two in order to demonstrate this a little more clearly. So hopefully you have your notes out here and we can get going as we talk about wars more fully. To start, I just want to remind you that the overall big topic for all these wars is the causes and effects of 20th century wars. So let's look at that a little carefully. Causes, why did these wars happen? Effects, what happened as a result of these wars? And then the 20th century component. Remember, that means only wars in the 1900s. And what's kind of funny about that, or I don't know about funny, but ironic, is that at the end of the 1900s and into the 20th century, there was kind of a big feeling and there was a big movement that maybe war would be something of the past, and if countries wanted to resolve problems or whatever else, they'd work towards, diplomacy and trying to kind of figure things out through other means. Well, what we obviously now know is that in the 100 years of the 20th century, many wars took place, and it was really kind of a defining feature. So, unfortunately, those plans didn't exactly come to light, but certainly there's a lot of wars for us to study and kind of compare against one another. Before we begin, though, I just wanted to kind of bring up a few questions, and you can jot down some of your responses or maybe just think about what this is. But, anyways, some of the things I put here is this one simply: why do we fight? If we think about the start of history and the start of humanity all the way to the present, there's been very few years when there's been peace in our world, and so that question of why do we fight so often and so frequently needs to kind of be brought into attention. Another question is kind of how have wars changed? Again, we just established that wars happen all the time, but how are they different? What new things have come about? And especially in the 20th century, we certainly did see new technologies, new reasons for fighting, new effects for fighting. So we want to kind of keep those in mind, but also be specific on how these wars have changed. The next one here, what happens after war has been fought? So again, going back to this 20th century component, and again, we see here with the first question and third question, these both have to do with the causes and effects overall. And then the last question here, what can we learn from war, whether it be a specific war at its core, whether it just be war as an overall concept. So just something I wanted to kind of put into your head, kind of have you thinking about as we go through this topic, so we can see what's kind of going on and what's happening. We're going to move on into the different types of wars, and there's four major types of war. The first one that we want to bring up is this concept of total wars. So what is a total war? Well, to put it most simply, in a total war, a country uses all their resources to fight. So you can think about the different resources that includes, but all their economic resources, all their human resources, all their military resources, everything in order to fight. And again, in a total war, you are impacted even if you are not actually on the front lines or fighting. You are impacted in some way, shape, or form. So if you're using all your resources to fight, what does that mean? Well, what you're trying to do is you're also trying to achieve a complete and total victory. There's not really this idea of getting down and compromising or getting down with these kind of fair peace agreements. If you win, you are the clear winner. You have achieved complete and total victory, and that means the other side is going to be the complete and total loser. So they're going to have to deal with the punishments or the other kind of repercussions of war. So again, these are things that again are not limited or they're not divided. They are completely and totally, all the resources, all the complete victory. Now, what does this mean using all your resources? Well, of course, because this is a war, probably your top priority is mustering up a very large fighting force. And what we see in the 20th century is it's not just an army anymore. We have an air force, we have navies, etc. And so it's getting many men. Well, again, it's going to be men for World War One, World War Two, women into the military in the United States and some other countries a little bit later on to fight in these military branches. Now, the way you're going to get as many people as possible is through conscription. So, again, you're going to have to implement some way in which you basically are going to force citizens of the country to fight. And so that's something that's going to have to be brought into effect and certainly is a component and the only way to really be successful in a total war. Another thing is that you have to use civilians. Now, again, not everybody can go and fight in the war, but for those that are staying at home, you are going to contribute. And so civilians are going to be doing things, for the most part, like, for example, the factories they work in are now going to be dedicated to creating weapons or creating armor or other supplies for the war effort. Civilians will often be asked to sacrifice themselves, food rationing, buying war bonds, other things. So again, even if you're back at home, you are contributing towards the war effort. What we also see in total wars is that we are using the most sophisticated weapons available, and actually, as the war is happening, we are continuing to develop weapons throughout. And again, that's a part of this in order to kind of ensure victory takes place. And so you can think about World War One, all the new weapons and all the new technologies that we saw. We can also see World War Two, and literally as the fighting was going on in the United States, we have those scientists and military personnel in secret working on the creation of the atomic bomb during the Manhattan Project as the war is happening. So again, that's certainly a part of developing weapons as the war is actually happening. The government plays a heavy role in total wars. And so, what this especially means is that the government is usually going to take control over the economy, or at least much more of a role than they had in the past. And the reason why is because they need to make sure that the economy and its efforts are directed towards the war. And so, they're the ones that are going to be able to visualize that. And so, the way that looks in countries is kind of different. But what this usually means is the government setting up different organizations to help convert factories to produce goods for the wartime, and also telling factories, hey, we need X amount of this good. This is what we need, it done. Does that mean you need to hire more workers? Hire more workers. We'll buy it from you, etc. So actually, if done correctly, like in the United States, this could mean heavy economic productivity and success. So either way, though, you need the government to take kind of a heavy role in this in order to work successfully. The government also plays a heavy role in trying to alter public opinion, and the best way we see that is through the use of propaganda. If you remind yourself, propaganda is basically almost like advertisement, one-sided messages in order to keep morale high. Again, wars are tough and they're destructive and they're brutal, and especially during total wars, the amount of destruction, the amount of death is really, really bad. However, you want to make sure everybody is supportive and nobody's talking badly and everyone has this united effort. Yes, we can do this. We are a team as this united country. And so, again, how countries kind of do that is different, but either way, during a total war, the use of propaganda in order to get kind of this united war effort is increasingly vital and important. Another component of total war, kind of going to this idea of complete victory, is that you are willing to win at all costs. And so what that oftentimes means is that you are willing to target civilians, you are willing to target public buildings, even if they are not, naval bases and stuff like that. And you think about World War II, that's a huge, huge part of it. But especially during those 20th century wars, we're really blurring the line between civilians and soldiers. So we want to be kind of thinking about that. And that's not a component of other wars, that's a specific component to something like a total war. Now, really, we only have kind of two major examples of a total war. And those are both in the 20th century, and they're both wars that we've already studied in the junior year, which is World War I and World War II, where we did have all these kind of components coming into play. And so, again, these are good case studies for us to think about. And again, really the only times in really history where we've seen war on this massive of a scale. So, really kind of interesting stuff. If we go here again, this picture you've seen it before is during World War One, and we can see some of the components of total war, primarily the use and development of weapons that we see going on here. Here is a machine gun, first introduced during World War One, and we see the soldiers wearing their gas masks because poison gas, also something introduced during World War One. I also have this picture, and this is actually a picture from World War II. You might recognize it as well. If you look right here, you can see our famous Prime Minister of Britain with Churchill and a top hat, and we see the destruction of London. And if you remember, definitely a part of total war during World War II was bombing of the major cities. And so, again, you can see the destruction coming into play here. Now, again, if you're a regular British citizen and, you weren't even in the war and this is what you were experiencing just living at home, you could imagine how devastating that can be. And that's why during a total war, it's so critical to keep public morale high. And you can actually look here at this picture, very interesting. The people, considering all the destruction, all the death that has taken place, do seem relatively content, and they do seem relatively okay. And again, adds a lot of credibility when your leader's out there with you experiencing it. And again, that's one of the reasons why Britain will be able to be successful in the total war effort during World War II. I also wanted to include this, and again, I've shown you this before, but here we have the deaths during World War II. And again, why does this depict total war? Well, a few reasons. First off, if you look at this carefully, that blue graph is the total deaths as a percentage of the population. And so what you notice there is that some countries are losing, 10, 15, almost 20% of their population as a result of the war. What you also see is that in red, you have the military deaths, and then in green, you have the civilian deaths. And in most countries, the civilian deaths are going to outnumber the military deaths. And again, that's not something that usually happens during war. It was certainly something that did not happen during the 1800s. During the war times, war was really limited to fighting against soldiers. However, during the total war period, we see that line being blurred. And again, this shows it very well. Almost 1/3 of all deaths in World War II will be actually civilian deaths as opposed to military. So again, very, very different, and certainly a component of this total war. Now, the next category that we're going to talk about is limited wars. And again, these have been the more common one throughout history. So what is a limited war? Well, to basically sound obvious, a limited war is not total in scope. And so, again, we do not need to have necessarily a total victory, or we don't need to use every single resource towards the war. And instead, in some way, shape, or form, our wars are going to be limited in some capacity. So we're not going to be doing all those things that we did in the total wars. And so what does that mean? Well, maybe the war is limited in area. We're only confined to some limited country or something like that, and that's where the war is taking place. It might be limited in its targets. We're not targeting civilians or anything like that. Instead, we're staying focused on just what's going on in the war effort. It probably is limited in the amount of weapons used. And again, what this means is that most likely during the wartime, we're not developing new weapons to suddenly use at the later part of the war. We're just going to use what we already kind of have. Another thing is that we're probably limited in our mobilization. When we have limited wars, we probably have enough soldiers in the active military that we do not need to have a draft, or we do not need to go to conscription. We're probably limited on where exactly we're having the armies and the different military forces go, and so that's definitely another component of the limited wars. Now, again, as I kind of mentioned already, certainly this means that we do not need to have a total victory. And so, again, think about a limited war such as Korea. Well, really, that war ends with basically, kind of like no change. It's almost just there, it's just kind of there. But the reality is, again, that is acceptable in this kind of war. We don't need to, like in World War II, drop the atomic bombs in order to get a country to surrender. Instead, we're much more willing to kind of sit down at the table. Hey, you get this, we get this. Let's end this fighting and move forward. And so, again, that's a big, big component of this. After 1945, the importance of having limited wars was very, very critical. And why is that the case? Well, remember, 1945 marks the end of World War II, which means the creation of nuclear weapons, and by 1949, both the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. And so in order to make sure that you did not have some war becoming total, whereas the two sides would have basically blown each other up, this became kind of the importance of what was going on and what was happening. Now, there are many limited wars. However, for our purposes, two really good case studies that we're going to be talking about over the summertime is going to be the Falklands War and the First Gulf War. And so the First Gulf War, you might have heard of the Falklands. You might not have. It's very much a kind of forgotten and a very strange war. However, it's a really good war for us to study, and especially when we see kind of the causes and effects of something like the Falklands War as opposed to the causes and effects of World War I and World War II. Very, very different. Now, there's another type of war that is called civil wars. And so we looked at, obviously, a civil war already, the United States Civil War. But what is a civil war? Well, this is when the same country is fighting each other. And so that's what we see going on in these things. The citizens of the same country fighting each other, usually to try to take over control or due to some disagreement or whatever else. That does not necessarily mean that foreign powers do not get involved. A lot of times in civil wars, foreign powers do get involved. However, it's to try to kind of influence the outcome, support the side they like. The reality is this is when we have usually two, sometimes more sides fighting against one another in order to, take control, take power, get their way, etc. Now, civil wars are kind of odd because there are various reasons why civil wars happen. Sometimes it's to try to, get something. Sometimes it's trying to totally overthrow and take control of the government and establish a new political order. And there's disagreements there. They happen for a large array of reasons, and a lot of them are specific to the specific country. Same thing with their effects. When we look at the effects of civil wars, what we also see is that sometimes the effects of a civil war are very, very significant. Sometimes they are relatively minimal. So, for example, we're going to be looking at the Chinese Civil War and the Russian Civil War. I have video for you on the Chinese Civil War, so I'll be walking you through it. And then for the Russian Civil War, you're going to read a book and kind of create a war report for the Russian Civil War. Well, spoiler alert, what you're going to see is that for the Chinese Civil War and the Russian Civil War, their effects were monumental because of the fact that what we saw is a complete change of government, a complete change of society, just a completely new dynamic all the way through. However, another civil war, like the U.S. Civil War, if you recall, yes, a lot of death, yes, a lot of destruction. It does end slavery in the United States, but if you remember, still with the Union victory, relatively the same political structure in place and all the rest of those things. However, if you remind yourself, these wars that we're going to be talking about in the summer are part of Paper 2, the World History Topics, and so you cannot bring up the U.S. Civil War. There's also another reason why you can't bring up the U.S. Civil War, which is that it's not actually in the 20th century. It's in the 19th century, 1861 to 1865. But either way, that U.S. Civil War does sit as kind of a good comparison to trying to understand these new civil wars that we're going to be talking about. In this picture from the Chinese Civil War, and there's Mao leading the communist forces, who will be victorious, and because of that will end up becoming the new heads of government in China. The last war is known as guerrilla war. Now, again, guerrilla war can take place in a civil war, take place in a limited war, usually not a total war, but maybe there's some theater of guerrilla fighting going on. Certainly that could be the case. Now, what is guerrilla war? Well, guerrilla war is Spanish for little war. And what does this mean? Well, it's unconventional. Now, again, when I say that, it doesn't mean it's unsuccessful. It just means it's not really conventional or standard types of fighting. Why is that the case? Well, typically what you have is a smaller kind of ragtag crew. They are kind of a non-traditional army, etc., fighting against a big traditional army. And so if the two were to go one-on-one and fight each other, well, this big, more formal army would just crush this smaller fighting force. So in order to be successful, the guerrilla fighters use tactics that rely on mobility. And so the goal here is to move around. And again, if you have a larger fighting force that's more formal, they are much less mobile. And so what we see here is major tactics used are raids and ambush. And so what you see is our guerrilla fighters, they're hiding, in the forest. They use the geography to their advantage. And then all of a sudden, this big traditional fighting force comes in, swoop on in, run havoc, as you can kind of see in the picture. And by the time this larger conventional fighting force has the ability to kind of situate themselves and realize what happened, this smaller guerrilla force is already kind of gone and moved on. So again, this is a component of war fare, especially into the 20th century. Now, where do we see guerrilla fighting happen in the 20th century? A lot of stuff going on where we see countries trying to fight against colonial rule. And because they are going up against the big, strong, conventional armies, the British armies, the French armies, etc., they're going to use these guerrilla tactics in order to be successful. You can also think about why this is important. Well, again, what they're able to do is they're able to gain the support of the public. And so these people who are the public are also like, yeah, we don't want this, colonial ruler in place, or we don't want this leader in place. We don't like them. They seem to be unfair. And so what we see here is that they are going to give these guerrilla fighters support. And they're going to say, hey, you guys can hide out here. And, there's this mountain pass over here you can use. And here, we'll give you food and all the rest of that stuff. And so that's important. The other thing is that guerrilla warfare became more popular after World War II, especially with a lot of the technological developments in regards to war, which would make guerrilla fighters more successful. So this is another component that you're kind of looking at and exploring here. Now, two major guerrilla wars or where guerrilla warfare tactics were used. In the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, and again, we talked about this a little bit this year. We're going to talk about it more in the upcoming year. Going to see guerrilla tactics being used to fight against Batista and his oppressive army. The other thing is that in the Chinese Civil War, Mao will use guerrilla tactics with his communist fighters in order to defeat the nationalists. So again, this becomes kind of an important tactic for the wartime. I showed you this picture before, but I think it's really nice. And again, so simple, but does kind of illustrate the way we kind of associate guerrilla warfare and how it's kind of conducted. And so again, we see some good adjectives to describe guerrilla warfare and some of their major tactics. So again, this is another way in which you try to be successful. All right, the last thing that we're going to talk about here are the causes and effects of wars. Now, again, if you remember from our talk of World War I and World War II, there are a lot of different causes of wars. We had a full unit dedicated to the causes of World War I. We had a full unit dedicated to the causes of World War II. However, what we do need to realize is that, again, there are many causes of war, but it's important that we're able to differentiate between the different categories for the different causes. And the reason why is because on the IB exam, they're going to ask specifically what was a political cause of one 20th century war. Again, not exactly that question, but they're going to ask these specific things: political, economic, social, etc. So we just want to be able to make sure we can distinguish between these. So first off, many wars are started by economic causes or economic reasons. So sometimes this is a conflict over economic resources, a need to secure raw materials, a desire to try to latch on to foreign markets, anything related to, economic desires. There's also sometimes social causes for war. This primarily revolves around disagreements or tensions between different social groups, social classes, etc. Political causes are frequent. What we see here is that there's different political parties, different political factions, political groups, etc., that seem to disagree over a variety of different things, and so sometimes war breaks out because of those disagreements. What we also see are ideological. And again, what's ideological or what's ideology? Well, it's all about a clash of ideas. And again, we see different groups and they have different ideas on how government and society should be run. And then you have another group, they say, no, it should be this way. And that sometimes leads to war as well. Finally, the last major cause that we want to look at is territorial. And so this could be some fight over a certain piece of land, dispute over who's in control of a certain place, etc., that can bring itself into war. And so these are other things that we kind of want to be looking at and exploring. And so our ability to kind of distinguish between these is really, really important. The reality is it usually doesn't follow under just one of these. Very rarely, usually there's some mixture of various causes coming into play. This is obviously something you're very familiar with, mania, to discuss the causes of World War I. And what we can see here is kind of a variety of different, social, political, ideological, territorial, economic, all kind of mashing up into these causes of World War I. Same thing here. These are kind of the causes of World War II. Again, this is very simplistic, but what you're seeing here is a variety of different things kind of happening here. But for the most part, we can establish them under those big categories. All right, the next thing that we need to discuss are the effects of war. And again, actually, we're going to put them in the same categories, but we're going to do so in a way in which we're trying to be successful here. So first off, just like the causes of wars, there are many effects of war. So what does that exactly mean? And again, same thing, very, very different categories. Well, obviously, economic can be a critical part of this, and war can definitely have a profound effect on the economic situation of a country. If you think about World War I, we obviously saw economic effects for different countries in the war. However, some were good and some were bad. And so if we take kind of our most extreme examples, well, for the bad, it was Germany. So devastated from the Treaty of Versailles and the other destruction that took place, they're going to basically be in economic ruin. And then on the alternate side, you have the United States, who used their position to start industrializing in high capacity. They traded with the Allied powers before their entrance, and so they actually came out after the war being kind of the strongest economic power of the world. So again, they don't always have to be bad effects. They can also sometimes be good. And so again, we want to make sure we're not so myopic, just think, oh, it's bad, it's bad. No, hold on. There can definitely be good. Another effect would be social. So again, how do the structures or traditions or customs of a society change by war? And so really, when we look at social effects for wars, we're looking at different social groups and social classes, but a group or a category we're definitely looking at are women and minorities. And so you can think about World War I, women throughout the world gaining more rights, especially the right to vote. That's definitely a social effect of World War I. After World War II, especially in the United States, we saw a big social effect for not only women, but also African Americans, Latino Americans, Japanese Americans, very much affected by what went on in the war. and even Native Americans. So again, we need to kind of be cognizant of that and realize that war can have far-reaching effects on kind of how society operates. Another effect would be the political effect. So again, how do structures of government change because of a war? And again, World War One is a good example of this. Think of all the empires that broke down and that were no longer. Think about the new countries in Central and Eastern Europe that were created out of these old empires. And again, varying levels of success, kind of a power vacuum in there because of their newness with democracy, but still something we want to be kind of looking at and exploring here. Again, ideological is always something we want to be looking at. And again, war can affect the ideology of people within a country or groups within a country, etc. And so you can think about World War One again. And if you think about World War One, we think about the Bolsheviks, who again already were upset with the government. They were already, angry and all the rest of these things. However, war really made them more kind of radical and really committed them to wanting to completely get rid of the government because of their ill-fated attempts to fight in the war, which really had not working out. And then finally, we also bring up territorial. And again, how do the amount of land that a country is in control of change as a result of the war? How does that kind of look? And again, you can think of World War One and all the territorial change that took place that made things different. And so again, that's always kind of a big thing that we want to be looking at. And again, as always, there are usually a variety of different factors, including all these five. Again, here's some of the effects of World War One, and again, this in no way includes all of them, but again, we kind of want to remember all these various things that are happening here, and even with this basic list, you can see that it's kind of a mixture of all these things. I also wanted to include this map after World War One. Again, World War One is a really good case study for causes and effects, and fighting as well, obviously. But again, we can see how much things have changed with the breakdown of, the German Empire, the breakdown of the Russian Empire, the breakdown of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. And instead, what we see are these new countries forming themselves in. So another thing that we want to be looking at here and just be cognizant of how the map changes. Now, remember, some of these wars that we talk about, there will be no territorial changes. Things will stay the same. But again, we need to be able to identify the fact that maybe there is no territorial effect if things just stay the same. Just briefly, I just want to remind you again what we'll be looking at as we continue through. Remember, this summer session is devoted to the causes and effects of 20th century wars, which is a paper 2 world history topic. So again, we're going to be seeing this through the lens of world history. Actually, only one of the wars directly involves the United States anyway, so we want to kind of be seeing this from a bigger perspective overall. Now, remember, what makes paper 2 different from paper 3 is, first off, obviously the world history component, but another big thing is that what we use are called case studies. And so I've shown you some of the questions already, but you'll see them more as we go through. But most of the paper 2 questions in regards to 20th century wars are going to make some statement, and they're going to say, discuss in reference to 2 wars. And really, the choice is yours on which ones you want to use. So the goal here is to get you enough wars in kind of your tool bag or in your back pocket that you can, pull out the best ones considering the question. Because again, certain questions lend themselves to certain wars more than others. And so again, we'll get better at identifying that as we move through, but just some things to bring in mind. So remember, if we're thinking about our major types of wars, for total wars, we've already looked at 2 total wars, World War I and World War II. And so again, you just don't want to lose sight of those wars as we continue through because again, those are 2 huge wars that we need to be knowledgeable of. The other category we see are limited wars. And again, over this summer, we're going to be looking at 2 specifically. The first is the Falklands War, which occurs in the 1980s. And it's in the Americas, South America most specifically. And again, we'll see that through. The other limited war we're going to look at is the First Gulf War, which takes place in another region, which is Africa and the Middle East. That's a war that directly involves the United States. finally, we'll finish out by looking at two civil wars, which is the Russian Civil War and then the Chinese Civil War. And if you remember the Russian Civil War, you're going to read a book and create the report by yourself. But the point here is that look what we have here. By the end of the summer session, we will have 6 wars in the tool chest and in the back pocket to choose from, and all of them covering one of IB's 4 regions. So if for some reason they asked you to only select from a certain region, you would be able to do so. So anyways, we're just trying to give you the most amount of ability to get through here. All right, thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and hopefully you move on to the limited war section where you're going to learn all about the Falklands War. Have a good one.